The biker gang roared into the quiet neighborhood, leaving chaos in their wake. Their leader, the brash and cocky Rev, kicked down the picket fence of elderly Frank Mason's home and yanked the American flag from its pole, tossing it into the dirt. "Your time's long gone, old man," he sneered, while his crew tore through the garden, crushing the roses Frank had nurtured for years. To them, Frank was just another helpless target, a silent figure incapable of fighting back. But what they didn't know was who Frank truly was, and the mistake they had just made. His calm, steady gaze and chilling words, "You've made your choice," were far more than empty threats. Their arrogance would lead to consequences none of them could have foreseen. What happened next became a lesson the gang would never forget. But let's start at the beginning. On the outskirts of a small American town, life flowed as peacefully as a stream through the woods. In a neat little house surrounded by a flourishing garden lived Frank Mason. Known to his neighbors as Old Man Mason, he was quiet, polite, and a little mysterious. His garden, especially his roses, was the pride of the neighborhood, a vibrant patch of color that seemed to reflect the orderliness of its caretaker. That tranquility shattered one sunny afternoon. A thunderous roar of motorcycle engines echoed through the streets as a gang of bikers sped into the neighborhood. Their presence was as loud and brash as their machines. At the head of the pack rode Roy Rev Harper, a hulking figure with tattoos that snaked across his face and a smirk that seemed permanently glued to his lips. Rev's sharp eyes caught sight of Frank, who was calmly cleaning a pair of garden shears. The older man, dressed in a simple button-up shirt and work gloves, appeared entirely unfazed by the racket. Rev's smirk widened. "Hey there, Grandpa," he bellowed, loud enough for the whole block to hear. "What's the matter? Planning your next war out here in the sticks?" The gang erupted in laughter, their voices mixing with the revving of engines. Frank didn't flinch. He looked up briefly, adjusted his glasses, and returned to his task. His lack of reaction was like a red rag to a bull. Rev dismounted his bike with exaggerated swagger, marching up to the white picket fence that bordered the garden. With a theatrical kick, he left a deep dent in the wood. "What's the deal, old-timer? You don't know how to welcome guests? We're thirsty out here," Rev sneered, spreading his arms as though expecting applause from his gang. Frank sighed, set down his shears, and stood. His movements were slow but deliberate, like someone accustomed to measured action. He approached the fence, his expression calm but firm. "Leave," Frank said simply. His voice was low but carried an edge of authority. "There's nothing for you here." The street seemed to hold its breath for a moment. Even the bikers' laughter faltered briefly before Rev burst out with a mocking guffaw. "Is that so?" he said, leaning forward as if daring Frank to repeat himself. "Boys, you hear that? Old Man Mason thinks he's the sheriff around here." The gang erupted again, and without further provocation, they mounted their bikes. Engines roared as they began tearing through the garden, crushing flowers under their tires. Roses that had taken years to cultivate were reduced to torn stems and petals scattered like confetti. The men laughed louder as the destruction continued. One biker, a wiry man nicknamed Snake, stopped long enough to pluck a rose from a half-broken bush. He sniffed it theatrically, then tossed it onto the ground and crushed it under his boot. "Smells like retirement," he jeered, earning more laughter from his companions. Meanwhile, Frank stood motionless, watching the scene unfold. His lack of visible anger only fueled the bikers' bravado. A few neighbors peeked out from behind curtains or stood at a distance, whispering amongst themselves. Mrs. Hargrove, who lived across the street, shook her head and muttered, "Poor Mason. Those thugs don't know who they're messing with." But Frank didn't react. Not to the destruction, not to the taunts, not even when Rev rode his bike dangerously close to the fence, scattering dirt onto Frank's shoes. After several minutes of chaos, Rev pulled up in front of Frank, his smirk intact, but his tone dripping with mockery. "What's the matter, General? Cat got your tongue?" Frank's calm, steady gaze met Rev's. Then he said, in a tone so even it was almost chilling, "You've made your choice." The words hung in the air, laden with an ominous weight that even Rev couldn't entirely shrug off. For a moment, his grin faltered, but he quickly covered it up with a shrug. Yeah, whatever you say, old man," he said, turning his bike around. "See you next time." The gang roared away, leaving a trail of torn-up grass, shattered rose bushes, and broken fence posts in their wake. Frank stood still, surveying the damage with an unreadable expression. Then, with a quiet sigh, he picked up his shears, brushed the dirt off his shoes, and headed back into the house. Behind closed doors, Frank made a single phone call. "Activate the team," he said into the receiver, his voice steady and calm. "We've got a situation." The chapter ends with Frank's house bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, the chaos outside a stark contrast to the silence within. Unbeknownst to the bikers, their reckless antics had just set something much bigger in motion. The next morning, the roar of engines returned, shattering the early quiet. Rev and his gang weren't done. They wanted more. This time, they came armed with spray paint, cans rattling in their hands as they swaggered toward Frank's fence. "Time to brighten up the old man's dull life," Rev announced with a grin, shaking a can of red paint. The gang laughed as they began defacing the pristine white pickets. Sloppy words and crude drawings appeared, each more ridiculous than the last. Snake stepped back to admire his work, a poorly drawn caricature of Frank wearing a crown. "What do you think, boss?" he asked, chuckling. "Looks just like him," Rev replied, then turned his attention to the American flag fluttering on Frank's lawn. He walked over, yanked it down, and tossed it into the dirt. A few neighbors gasped audibly, their eyes peeking through curtains. Frank stepped onto his porch, silent and calm as ever, his hands resting lightly on the railing. His expression was unreadable. "You're way too proud for someone who doesn't fight back," Rev sneered. "Maybe it's time we showed you some humility." When Frank didn't respond, Rev nodded toward the gazebo in the center of the yard. "Snake, light it up." Snake smirked and pulled out a lighter. Within moments, the gazebo was ablaze, flames climbing hungrily up the wood. Smoke billowed into the air, and the smell of burning roses filled the yard. The gang whooped and laughed as the fire spread. Still, Frank didn't flinch. He stood there, his gaze steady and quiet. Finally, Snake gestured toward the house. "What's next, boss?" But before Rev could respond, Frank's voice cut through the noise, calm and firm. "That's enough." Rev turned, feigning surprise. "Oh, he speaks. What's the matter, Grandpa? Losing your cool?" Frank stepped closer, his voice low but sharp. "You've made your choice. Don't say I didn't warn you." For a moment, Rev hesitated, a flicker of unease crossing his face. Then he shrugged, laughing it off. Yeah, whatever you say, old man." As the gang roared off, still laughing, Frank stood in silence. The neighbors exchanged worried looks, their unease growing. Inside his house, Frank made a single phone call. "It's time," he said simply. The camera mounted discreetly in the garden came to life with a quiet hum, swiveling to track the damage outside. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. On the third day, the roar of engines once again echoed down the street as Rev and his gang approached Frank's house. Confident and smug, they dismounted their bikes, ready to unleash another wave of chaos. But this time, the scene waiting for them was anything but familiar. As they approached the house, movement stirred in the shadows. Silent and precise, a group of individuals emerged, men and women in camouflage, their postures rigid, their faces cold and unreadable. They positioned themselves in a loose circle, casually but deliberately blocking every exit. Rev stopped mid-stride, his smirk faltering as he took in the sight. Who are you people?" he barked, his bravado slipping into confusion. The sound of a door creaking open drew their attention. Frank stepped out of the house, no longer the mild, quiet gardener they'd mocked. He wore a crisp, button-up shirt, and his piercing gaze locked onto Rev with unnerving precision. In his hands, he held an old, slightly faded photograph. The gang shifted uneasily, exchanging glances as Frank descended the steps with a deliberate calm. He stopped a few feet from Rev, holding up the photo for the gang to see. It was unmistakable, a younger Frank Mason in full military dress, a patch on his shoulder bearing the unmistakable insignia of a certain government agency. "Allow me to introduce myself," Frank began, his voice firm and steady. "Frank Mason, former director of Special Operations." His gaze swept over the gang. "And these fine people you see around you? My former team." The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. The smirk on Rev's face disappeared entirely, replaced by a pale, uncertain expression. Snake, struggling to plant a rosebush, muttered under his breath, "This isn't what I signed up for." A nearby operative raised an eyebrow, and Snake quickly added, "But it's what I deserve." The neighbors began to gather, cautiously stepping out of their homes. Mrs. Hargrove crossed her arms, a satisfied smile on her face, as she watched Rev scrub the front porch. "He missed a spot," she called out, drawing chuckles from the growing crowd. As the sun began to set, the yard was finally restored, looking even better than it had before. But Frank wasn't quite finished. He turned to one of his operatives, who nodded and handed him a folded flag. "Mr. Harper," Frank said, stepping toward Rev, "you forgot something." Rev's face turned pale as he recognized the flag. He hesitated, then took it with trembling hands. "What do I—" he began, but Frank cut him off with a single look. Under the watchful eyes of the neighbors, Rev carefully raised the flag, securing it to the pole before stepping back. Frank approached the pole, adjusting the flag so it flew perfectly. "Now," Frank said, his voice low but firm, "apologize to everyone." Rev turned to the neighbors, his voice shaky but loud enough to carry. "I'm sorry for what we did, to all of you." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd, followed by scattered applause. Mrs. Hargrove added, "Good enough for now." As the bikers were escorted out of town, Frank turned to his team. "Thank you, friends," he said, his voice warm. "I think I can take it from here." The operatives nodded, their job done, and began to pack up. The neighbors, emboldened by the day's events, crowded around Frank to shake his hand and offer their thanks. One voice rose above the others, belonging to a young man who had been watching from the sidelines. "Looks like these bikers will be walking their bikes past this street from now on." The crowd burst into laughter, and even Frank allowed himself a small smile as he turned toward his house. The evening light cast long shadows over the freshly restored garden, and Frank paused to admire the roses swaying gently in the breeze. With a final wave to the neighbors, Frank stepped inside, his calm demeanor unchanged. But the street, and the people who lived on it, would never see him the same way again.